Good morning all, and welcome to the Signature Veto Request webinar. We appreciate your attendance today, and thank you so much for all your engagement over this very interesting and crazy year. First off, I would like to welcome our Executive Director, Carolyn Coleman, to make some opening remarks. Here's our agenda, and I'll give it over to Carolyn. My apologies.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you and our advocates and our public affairs team for all of their hard work during this session. As Melanie said, my name is Carolyn Coleman, and I'll be brief because there's so much substance. I want to quickly let you all get to hear from our experts. First off, let me say thank you for joining this webinar. As we all know, the legislature may have adjourned for now, but that doesn't mean that our advocacy has stopped. Now is that time in the process where we will focus our efforts on the governor's office and the governor to make sure that as he considers whether or not to sign a bill or to veto a bill, that it's very clear to him what we need him to sign to support our cities and what we need to reject, frankly, because it could reject or could do harm to our cities. The League is going to be working very hard over the next couple weeks to make sure that our messages are heard loud and clear within the governor's office. But just as we did during the legislative session with the legislature, we're also going to need your help to get that done. So that's why I'm so excited that all of you are on the call today, and look forward to hearing the presentations from our lobbyist. I also want to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of the city leaders. I know that, as Melanie said, these have been challenging and certainly unprecedented times, from dealing with a global pandemic to addressing social unrest in your communities, and now to leading your communities through recovery and reopening, and doing so safely. I know it's certainly been an unusual year, but not a surprise to all of us at the League. You all have been incredible leaders, getting the job done each and every day in your communities. And I know that you've been doing that without all of the resources that you need or deserve from the state and the federal government. And that's why the League in the coming months will continue to be your voice in Sacramento, as well as your voice in Washington, D.C., to make sure that we can get the resources that you need to continue to move your communities forward. As we've all been saying this year, we are stronger together, and I know that we will get through this together. And I wouldn't be the executive director if I didn't also put in a plug for the annual conference. I look forward to seeing you all virtually in a couple of weeks. So have a great webinar, and thanks again for all that you do for our communities. Back to you, Melanie.
Thanks, Carolyn. Greatly appreciate your remarks. And I should have introduced myself at the beginning. I'm Melanie Perrin. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for Advocacy and Public Affairs. We're all a little sleep deprived in this realm right now because it has been a very crazy, interesting couple of weeks leading up to the last night of the legislative session on Monday, which ended about 2 a.m. I also want to give a huge thanks to the advocacy team and our regional affairs teams. They are the ones who are really working with the legislature and also making sure that you all are engaged, getting the information you need timely to make those last minute calls that we were asking of you on Sunday night and Monday, making sure that bills that we either really much supported or did not, making sure that you were being heard. So appreciate all your efforts on that. I'm going to give a quick overview and housekeeping items of how today's webinar will proceed. So if you plan on speaking today, please make sure your audio is connected, and you should have been prompted to connect your audio when you joined the webinar. All attendees have been muted, and this webinar is being recorded. So how to ask a question. To write in a question, please select the Q&A box on your toolbar. You can also upvote other attendees' questions if you have the same question. This helps us prioritize those questions when they are coming in during the presentation. We will be breaking during the webinar. We'll have set aside time after a couple of each of the presenters to ask specific questions and do a Q&A portion. So please just ask Q&A throughout the presentations. And this is your league legislative team. You will be hearing from all of them today. And again, just my gratitude and thanks to everything that they have endured and conquered this year, as we've all had to navigate the environment of how to advocate and lobby in a virtual world. So they have met the moment, as the governor would say, and have stepped up to the challenge, and I'm so grateful for each of them. And with that, I'd like to hand this over to Derek Dolphy to go through environmental quality.
All right, thank you, Melanie, and good morning, everyone. As Melanie said, my name is Derek Dolphy. I am the Environmental Quality and Community Services Lobbyist today. You will note that there aren't actually any community services bills we'll be talking about because, as I'm sure you'll hear from my fellow lobbyists, this was quite the unusual legislative year, and many bills were sidelined because of the COVID-19 reality of how the legislature could and could not conduct their business, as well as the very compressed timelines due to them having to recess several times because of COVID-19 outbreaks in the capital community. So unfortunately, I don't have any community services bills to discuss with you today, but there are a couple of environmental quality bills that I did want to run through with you very briefly. So the first one is SB 1044 by Senator Allen, which is about firefighting equipment and PFAS in the firefighting foam. This is a bill that essentially would prohibit the sale or use of firefighting foam in the state of California that has PFAS chemicals intentionally added. As I don't need to tell many of you, local governments often bear the brunt of having to clean up PFAS when and if it enters into our groundwater. So this is a measure that both will help the groundwater in the long run, as well as it doesn't compromise any safety from our firefighting, brave firefighters in battling wildfires when it comes to using the most up-to-date technology. This bill is actually sponsored by the California Professional Firefighters and was supported by the Cal Chiefs as well. It was a pretty feel-good bill. We're happy to see that out of all the many bills that were culled this year, this was one of the few that was able to make its way through the process. So we are sending a request for signature on this bill to the governor and hope that he'll be able to sign it to make sure that we can not inadvertently help one crisis, which is putting out a fire, but add to another crisis, which is adding these PFAS and PFOA chemicals into our groundwater and into the environment. So the next bills I want to talk about are AB 1080 by Assemblywoman Gonzalez and SB 54 by Senator Allen. These were bills that the League was very engaged on for the last 2 years in the legislature. They were identical measures. One was a Senate vehicle, one was an Assembly vehicle. And essentially what they would have done was set out waste and reduction and recycling goals that establish a comprehensive framework for the use of plastic packaging and producers that would be overseen by CalRecycle. This was essentially an effort to try and make sure that the single-use plastic products and packaging items that we all use every day, especially when we're doing a lot more takeout, such as plastic utensils, clamshell, takeout boxes, etc., making sure that the producers of these plastic products actually use chemical or use plastic types that are recyclable for local governments. So it was essentially attempting to push these plastic producers towards making more recyclable products, using more recyclable material, and thus helping us as local governments save money on the collection and processing costs, as well as hopefully drive more markets for our recyclable materials. So that way we don't actually have to landfill them or pay more money than they're worth to actually have somebody come and take it off our hands. Obviously, with the loss of the international commodities market on recycling recently, I know a lot of cities have reached out saying that they have recyclable materials, but no one to sell it to. So this we were hoping would actually help solve that problem. Unfortunately, it was deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra likes to say. Both of these bills never came up for a vote at the end of session, both last year and this year. Don't quite understand what the thought process was behind not letting these get a full vote in both the Senate and the Assembly, but these bills failed to pass and unfortunately will not be moving forward. I have spoken with Senator Allen, and he has told us that he's committed to this issue and working with cities on this next year. So if this is something that you're extremely interested in, and I know many of you were supportive of, and I thank you for your advocacy on that front, if that's something that you're interested in, please do follow up with me in the fall months, as I'm sure Senator Allen and Assemblywoman Gonzalez are going to take another run at this in 2021. So sad to see that these didn't happen, but onward to the next year, and hopefully we'll get something done in 2021. Lastly, on the environmental quality front, I do want to mention two wildfire funding proposals that were being kicked around at the end of session this year. Neither of them passed, but I think it's worth noting kind of where the legislature was in their thought process. So obviously, as all of us know, there was numerous fires, hundreds of fires that were started in recent days and weeks, thanks to both dry lightning strikes as well as just extremely hot, dry, arid conditions with high winds in California. So in order to kind of respond to that, the legislature had two different proposals. The first proposal, which was introduced the week before the last week of session, so last week, was AB 1659 by Bloom with numerous co-authors. This was essentially an attempt to create a $3 billion wildfire mitigation fund by extending around $1 surcharge on investor-owned utility ratepayers and then securitizing that revenue stream through bonds to be able to pay for wildfire mitigation efforts in IOU territory. This was an extension of the existing DWR charge that utility customers already pay back from the early 2000 rolling blackout crisis. Back then, they added this surcharge to be able to pay for the bonds that helped get us out of that crisis. It was planning on sunsetting. This would have extended that for until 2035, I believe. So obviously, with a lot of pushback from ratepayer groups and the investor-owned utilities as well as others, this bill was heard in the Senate but never came up for a vote on the full Senate floor. It had a lot of opposition, and the Senate essentially slowed that and stalled that proposal from moving forward. The Senate's response to that, though, was a last-minute play to try and get a $500 million wildfire proposal out of general fund dollars. So this would have been money coming from the general fund of the state and not being leveraged on ratepayers or by raising any sort of tax or fee. And this would have gone to existing wildfire mitigation grant programs. So inside of that, there was two grant programs that we were very supportive of, among a few other things. One of them was for CalOES to extend and bolster their backup power generation and resiliency grants that I know a lot of you applied for last year. The other one was from the California Natural Resources Agency, trying to help local governments set up cooling centers and community centers in response to a lot of these extreme weather conditions, as well as from wildfire smoke, heat events, and of course, wildfires themselves, among other disasters. So this was a proposal that kind of came up at the last minute of the end of session. It had a lot of interest. There was a lot of back and forth about if this actually was going to happen or not. But in talks, apparently there was a disagreement over this proposal between the Senate and the Assembly. And because there was that disagreement, this bill actually never went into print and never came up for a vote in either a committee or on the floor. So we were sad to see that there was no additional funding for wildfire mitigation grants or funding this year, but are hopeful as the budget recovers over the next few years in the state, that we'll be able to see more money go to that, because obviously our communities are desperate to get these vital resources to help us prepare for and respond to wildfires if and when they occur in our state. And unfortunately, they're becoming more and more frequent and year-round. So with that, that ends my section. I'm happy to answer any questions if people have it. Please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll respond to that at the appropriate time. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our Governance, Transparency, and Labor Relations lobbyist, Mr. Bijan Mariar. Bijan.
Thank you, Derek. Good morning, everyone. Excited and happy to join you all to talk about the GTLR legislation that is headed towards the governor's desk. Next slide. Okay. So the first two bills I'm going to discuss are primarily related to the state's COVID-19 response, and there are some pretty significant implications here for cities. So the first I'm going to start with is AB 685. This bill requires certain notification requirements to be made by both public and private employers in the event that, as an employer, you are notified of one of your employees testing positive for COVID. And in that event, the bill lays out certain requirements that you have to complete within 1 business day. And the requirements are largely centered around notifying other employees that were in certain proximity to that employee, and also reporting the information to the Department of Public Health. Notably, I would say this bill was in a much worse form only a couple weeks ago. It used to require the reporting timeline to be completed in 24 hours as opposed to 1 business day, and it used to include civil penalties of up to $10,000 per violation of the notification timeline. However, the bill was significantly amended to make it so that the notification timeline is 1 business day. And now, if there are any issues with your implementation of the notification, the fines and fees are currently tied to CalOSHA's existing schedule of fines for certain violations. We expect there to be cleanup legislation early in next year's session to make the bill even more workable. That's a commitment that we've received from the author's office. Ideally, public employers would be excluded from these requirements because you all, as good employers and as stewards of your workforce, are already engaged in a lot of this. So it's not going to be as heavy a lift for public sector employers as it is for the private sector employers. But given that we're still going to request the veto because on principle, we think that public employers should be excluded from these requirements. The second bill is SB 1159, which resolves the outstanding workers' compensation issue related to COVID-19. Going into this crisis, I think it was readily apparent to those of us who are kind of observers of the workers' compensation dynamics that there was going to be some change to the system, notably because for public employers, our public safety workforce have really been on the front lines of responding to our community's needs and still going out there and doing their jobs despite the threat of COVID-19. There were 3 bills that were circulating towards the end. This is the only one that advanced to the governor's office, and we expect, given the governor's public pronouncements of wanting to do more for workers, that he's expected to sign it. Nonetheless, we're still going to be requesting a veto, largely because as a matter of policy, we oppose presumptions created in the workers' compensation system. That is to say, we oppose the creations of presumptions that an illness or an injury is presumed to have occurred as a result of their employment. This measure in particular also creates an approach that the administration has been asking for related to clusters. And what that means is that if you have an outbreak, which is defined in the bill as if you have less than 100 workers and 4 individuals contact COVID-19, that then creates a presumption that the outbreak is related to their employment and creates a presumption for those employees. If you have more than 100 employees, it's going to be based on 4% of your workforce. Now, it is a rebuttable presumption, so it's not conclusive, meaning that using a preponderance of evidence standards, you could argue that it was not created as a result of the employment, but it's still a pretty high threshold. The other measures that did exist arguably may have been worse. So while we think this is still workable, and even though we've been told that claims really for COVID-19 in the workforce aren't being denied, we're still going to request a veto because we think that presumably if the governor wanted to, as long as we're in a state of emergency, he could extend his workers' compensation executive order, which relative to this bill is much more favorable. Next slide, please. So these 2 bills are now different labor components that move forward despite the announcements made by the legislature that bill packages were supposed to be trimmed and supposed to be related to the crisis. These 2 managed to squeak by. AB 1947 authorizes one-sided attorney's fees in the event of violations of Labor Code Section 1102.5. That section governs the protections of whistleblowers that go to agencies. So for instance, if you're an employee who's retaliated against, you can bring an action saying that your whistleblower protections have been violated. And if you prevail, this bill explicitly authorizes only one-way attorney's fees. So if you end up, as an employer, end up prevailing in the action, you're not authorized to recover those fees. So we'll be submitting a veto letter. We'll be setting a veto request for that one. The next one is SB 1383. This measure expands the job protected leave that you all as employers are required to provide under CFRA to run that ideally should run concurrently with FMLA. It reduces the threshold of employees from 50 employees down to 5. And our main concern with this is that, I think first of all, people come to public employment because they understand there's a certain level of protection and benefits that's provided by that. So again, there's this kind of general opposition to these labor mandates, especially at a time when demand for government services is at its highest, while our tax revenue is at its lowest. And that was one reason for our opposition. Secondly, the fact that any type of interference or coordination or any type of managing you as an employer want to do, if you have multiple requests under SB 1383, are not allowed. And you could actually be litigated against if your employee alleges that you interfered with their right to exercise this leave. Originally, when this proposal was introduced, just to provide a little bit of history, it was part of the governor's January budget proposal. Public employers didn't oppose this leave, largely because the environment we were living in January was just so different. And we certainly understand the kind of political discussion around leave and the availability to have job protected leave and what that means for families. However, given the corona environment, given all the challenges we faced since March, we really think it's an inappropriate time to introduce these new leave proposals. And I would also add that our interest also aligned heavily with the business community on this one, because we know the success of local economies, the success of local governments is tied to the success of our local economies. And so additional labor mandates that make it difficult for businesses to open or expand their operations do present a long-term challenge to our tax base, which has already suffered irreparably because of COVID-19. So this is the governor's proposal. We don't have high hopes that he can be persuaded to veto his own idea, but we're going to give it our best effort. Next slide, please. So CalPERS. So AB 2967 is a very technical bill. It came as a result of a city amending their CalPERS contract to exclude fire professionals from their contract so that they could create their own non-CalPERS fire department. Notably, the California Professional Firefighters, who were the sponsor of this legislation, I think to say they went apoplectic would be perhaps an understatement. And so this bill kind of remedies it by preventing any CalPERS employer from removing any category of employees from their contract through the contract amendment process. And so we'll be requesting a veto. Our policy has always been to advocate for more flexibility in the city's dealings with CalPERS. And this bill, as unique a situation as it is to amend your contract to remove a class of employees, we really do think this legislation removes one of the tools from the toolbox that is necessary for you all to control costs as we continue to grapple with CalPERS's underperformance in the stock market. Next slide, please. So elections and transparency. So I decided to save the best for last, and these are two bills that we are going to be asking signatures from the governor on. So the first is AB 992. This is a bill that the league actually sponsored. And what it would do is that it would clarify the Brown Act so that social media communications between council members and their constituents is allowed via social media, that it removes the ambiguity. We had heard from many cities across the state that city attorneys often counsel members to not engage necessarily directly on social media because there is that concern about whether it is or isn't a Brown Act violation. This clarifies that engagement with the constituents is not, but it still preserves that coordination or communication related to the subject matter jurisdiction of the council between council members is still prohibited. So it still preserves the spirit of those safeguards against those types of communications between council members, but now gives more freedom and certainty to council members that they can engage with their constituents on social media without having to worry about violating the Brown Act. And then the last bill in the GTLR space is SB 970 from Senator Umberg. This bill changes the primary election date in non-presidential election years. So in the gubernatorial election years, the primary date will be pushed back from March to June. And so this bill was deemed to be necessary as part of the slew of elections changes that had to happen this year, largely out of concern that the Census Bureau would be delayed in its ability to deliver the apportionment and districting data that state and local jurisdictions rely on for their districting and redistricting processes. Right now, it's unclear. I mean, I don't think anyone has a good enough crystal ball to tell you when the Census Bureau will actually finish their work and when the data will be delivered. But in order to make sure that we have enough time to do the redistricting that's required, we're asking the governor to sign this bill. One point that I want to highlight for all of you is that as a result of this, some of you may have council members who were, for instance, perhaps elected in 2017 and had their terms extended by 12 months to comply with more recent changes to the elections code. There is a possibility that some council members might not be able to sit on council for those 3 months in between the change from March to June. So I would encourage you all, if you are a city attorney, to check your council members' terms or to raise the issue with your city attorneys just to make sure that you won't be without council members or at worst without a quorum during that 3-month period between March and June of 2022. So that should be all of the GTLR bills, and happy to answer any questions.
At this time, we've gotten just a couple of more general questions about process. First off, we will be providing the webinar PowerPoint slides after the webinar, so stay tuned. We will make sure you get those. Jason, do you want to talk about template letters since we talked about that in the Q&A?
Yeah, so template letters for all of these bills, most of them should be up on our website now, but they will definitely all be there by the end of today. You will see our letter requesting that sign or veto along with a sample letter, and you can find all those links in the bill tracking function on our website.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions at this point in the Q&A, so let's move on. Jason, if you'd like to go through the housing and other bills.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's Jason Ryan, your Housing and Economic Development Lobbyist. The next slide here is going to talk about really the only sign letter that we are requesting for our members and that we are going to submit. It's been a pretty remarkable year within the housing area this year. I mean, the legislature started off with hundreds and hundreds of bills that were pertaining to housing and land use. Many of those were very detrimental, and many of those have died. And I have a few slides to talk about some of the bills that died, but this is one that actually made it through. AB 434 by Daley. It's actually a really good bill that looks at some of the internal functions, some of the contracts, some of the grants within the housing grant programs, and it streamlines them, which is really important. It's going to streamline and align those 6 rental housing programs into one space. It's going to be one application for folks to apply for it, and then you're going to be able to be awarded within those 7 programs, which is fantastic. So that's all going to get started in 2022. The department needs a little time in order to coordinate all that. But we've seen a lot of streamlining measures over the years for local government. This is really the first one streamlining, state government. And I think this is going to be a big help to a lot of our communities. And hopefully we'll see those awards not only go out more quickly, but also we might see more construction in our communities, which is what everybody really wants to see. Now here on the next slide, I have a couple, 2 or 3 slides there that are highlighting some of the key bills that failed to advance this year. And when you look at the various bills that failed to advance, it's important to think about how much the world has changed, since January. It's quite remarkable. I mean, even if you take out just, COVID and everything that we've all been dealing with that public health crisis, the legislature had very high hopes to address housing this year. In January, we saw the demise of SB 50 for the second time. It was basically the 3rd version of that bill. The pro tem Atkins over in the Senate, she took this issue and put it around her neck and said, hey, we're gonna solve this issue. I'm going to lead the charge. She formed a working group of 7 senators to come up with a package of bills. And nearly all of those bills ended up failing this year. And I'll get to some of those here in a minute. But the first bill you see on here is AB 795. This was a league-sponsored bill. For the second year in a row, we teamed up with Senator Bell to try to get more resources to our cities to get affordable housing and key infrastructure built in our communities. This was a $10 billion proposal. Last year, we were successful in getting that proposal, a little bit different version of it, but the proposal to the governor's desk, and he vetoed it. This year, we came up a little bit short, and we didn't get it. It got held in Appropriations Committee on the Assembly, which is unfortunate. But again, the league was fighting for $10 billion for affordable housing and those community investments. The next couple bills you see here, 899 and 902 and 995, these measures all failed as well. And we were adamantly opposed to SB 899. This was a bill that's actually quite similar to a version of a bill we saw a few years ago that gave BART, which is a very rapid transit district, some land use authority over their property. This would have done something very similar for hospitals and nonprofit religious institutions as well as academic institutions. And, again, it would have given them a really, the land use authority on their property. We were opposed to this bill, and thankfully it was held as well. SB 902 is a bill that would have initially been opposed to. This bill would have done a couple of things. One of them, it would have been a mandate on local government to perform certain functions, and we certainly opposed that. In the end, SB 902 was really an opt-in bill for cities to choose to upzone if they saw fit, and then they wouldn't have to do CEQA on that upzoning. They would still have to do CEQA on the projects, but not on that upzoning. We did not have a position on this bill since it was optional for our cities to use. Some cities liked it, other cities didn't like it, but ultimately that measure failed as well. SB 995 Atkins, this was a bill that was going to expand the CEQA judicial review process, the expediting process, to include certain housing projects. This is something we've seen with some of the sports arenas over the years. In the last minutes of session, this one did not come up for a vote because they simply ran out of time. And this bill, much similar to the next slide here, where we're talking about SB 1120, these are another Atkins bill that actually got the votes, passed off this assembly floor, went back over to the Senate, and due largely to some of the infighting within the Assembly and the Senate over some other unrelated bills, they just ran out of time, and those bills just didn't get taken up and then are dead for the year. So on the next slide here, you'll see some of these other bills. And you'll see SB 1120 is the second bullet there. That was the bill that was going to require us to allow for a duplex to be added to a single family parcel, and then it also allow for a property owner to split a parcel if it was at least 1,200 square feet, or if it create at least two 1,200 square feet parcels, and then they could add duplexes to those as well. We had a supportive amended position on this bill after lots of negotiations with the author over several months. Unfortunately, we did not get the needed amendments to the bill, so we had no position on the bill. And ultimately, this measure ended up failing because the clock ran out, essentially. Once it went back to the Senate was certainly going to concur in the amendments and would have passed it since it was their leader's bill. But again, the Senate got the bill with minutes to spare, and it just ended up failing. The first bullet you see here, SB 1088, this was a density bonus bill that we also had an opposed position on. They did take some amendments that would have clarified using density bonus law to undermine local inclusionary housing ordinances. The amendments didn't quite, work out all of our issues, so we remained with an opposed unless amended position, but ultimately this measure failed as well. The third bullet, you'll see SB 1299. This was actually a really good bill by Senator Portantino that was looking to incentivize cities to rezone idle retail spaces for housing. I mean, this is something I think most everybody could get behind. It was incentive-based in that you'd have access to additional funds to offset the loss of some of those retail sales tax dollars. And again, it was a thing that the cities could choose to do it themselves if they wanted to do it. But ultimately that measure failed. Along with the final bullet here, 1385, this was a similar bill. It wasn't quite an incentive, it was more of a mandate, but it would have required cities to allow for housing in certain commercial zones and retail zones. This measure failed as well. The next slide, please. I think it will note here that really in the housing space, it's been really more about what didn't happen more than what actually happened. There are very few housing bills that actually have made it to the governor's desk. And you can see here's the assembly version. I mean, there's another 5 bills here that failed to advance. AB 1279 was a SB 50 kind of light bill. It dealt with high resource areas or high opportunity areas. That measure failed this year. We supported AB 3040, which was a bill that would have given cities additional RENA credit in their housing element if they did certain upzoning in certain places. Again, it was completely optional for cities. If they wanted to do it, they could do it. And if they did, they had more certainty in actually getting those sites classified as adequate sites. 3107 was similar to the other bill that I mentioned, the 1385. This again deals with changing the uses within commercial zones and retail zones. This measure failed as well. And then the final two bills that I wanted to mention here, AB 3269 by Senator Chu. This bill would have been quite the mandate for cities and the state. It would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, to not only create plans to address homelessness, but then also to take certain efforts to reduce homelessness by 90% within each of our jurisdictions. And this bill, thankfully was scuttled. We were opposed to this measure as well, largely on the grounds that, we can certainly do a lot as local governments to address homelessness, but we need that partner in the state with those dollars. We can't go alone and try to do it on our own and have this mandate of a 90% reduction. And then finally, AB 3300. This was a bill that was going to set aside, a couple $2 billion a year in homelessness grant funding. It would have went to homelessness grants along with some affordable housing. This bill, again, cost billions of dollars a year, and it was held in the Appropriations Committee as well. And I believe that's all of my slides. And if it is, we can go ahead and hand it on over to Mr. Harvey, our public safety lobbyist. And I think we'll have another session for questions following Charles.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Jason. Before I get into the bulk of my slides, I just want to kind of give a quick overview of what's transpired over the course of over the summer. So if you could go back to the other slide real quick. So just over the course of several weeks, after the passing of the budget bill on June 15th, and really during what was perhaps the height of the nation's civil unrest in 2020, following the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the California legislature introduced upwards of 24 bills impacting police and public safety. And, of these, 21 were gut and amend measures, meaning that they were recently amended into what were already existing bills and had not received a policy committee hearing for that house. But, collectively, these measures represented perhaps the most drastic push for police reform in an era of social justice reform efforts. And so many of these proposals died before reaching the floor of whatever house the bill was currently located. But there were two significant bills that ultimately emerged that the league was closely tracking. I don't have slides for those, but those are Senate Bill 731 by Senator Bradford and Senate Bill 776 by Senator Skinner. And so just in short, 731 sought to remove immunity protections for all public employees and public employers, essentially, and also establish a decertification process for peace officers. 776, meanwhile, would have essentially made personnel records for every use of force incident subject to disclosure, including records for non-sustained and exonerated cases, and would have mandated the retention of all complaints received by law enforcement departments, really for a very long time, removing a 5-year limitation on that. And so both of those bills, 731 failed to secure a vote on the assembly floor, and 776, while passing out of the assembly, the author ran out of time to get a Senate floor vote, concurrence floor vote. So both of those bills failed to reach the governor's desk. The league had an opposed position on both measures, but I would expect those proposals to be reintroduced in some variation in 2021, as social justice reform advocates, were probably left rather bitter about the legislature not taking those up for a vote. So just wanted to kind of set that stage and give that overview for kind of the focus for what, the league's focus on public safety matters throughout the majority of the summer. So I'm going to quickly cover a couple of other items that did pass out of the legislature. So if we go to the next slide, we'll start with AB 1775 by Joan Sawyer. So under current law, current law makes it an infraction, essentially, with increasing penalties for multiple offenses for using the 911 system for any reason other than an emergency. This bill provides for harsher consequences if the call was based on a false claim and made in order to harass another person based on perceived characteristics of a protected class. So, this bill is in response to the many highly publicized examples of unnecessary or patently false calls to law enforcement that threaten people of color, most notably. And the bill also reduces barriers to bringing a civil action for this conduct by stating that the police calls are not privileged communications that would be exempt from civil liability. And then additionally, it would amend the Ralph Civil Rights Act to clarify that intimidation by a threat of violence includes making a false report to police that another person is engaged in unlawful activity. So we can go to the next slide. And I'm sorry, we are requesting a signature for that bill, 1775, as we are for this bill, AB 2617, by Assemblymember Gabriel. This measure seeks to do three things, essentially. It states that any person who owns or possesses a firearm or ammunition with knowledge that they are prohibited from doing so because of a valid order that was issued out of state that is similar or equivalent to what California deems a gun violence restraining order is guilty of a misdemeanor. So, can't bring firearms or possess firearms in California when another state has specifically forbade such activity. Second, this bill prohibits a person convicted of this misdemeanor from owning a firearm or ammunition for a 5-year period, beginning upon the expiration of that existing out-of-state order. And then finally, the measure clarifies that a law enforcement officer who requests a temporary emergency gun violence restraining order has to file a copy of that order with the court within 3 court days after issuance. So that bill has been supported by the league since policy committee back in April. And so that's certainly a measure that we expect the governor to easily sign. One other bill that is not referenced here, but that the league was closely tracking, Assembly Bill 1506 by Assemblymember McCarty. Don't have that listed here because we did remove formal support for that bill, but we are not, so we're neutral. We don't have a position on it. But upon its introduction, that bill sought to require the Department of Justice, upon request by local government agencies, to conduct independent investigations into deadly force incidents. The final version of this bill, AB 1506, has provisions that both require DOJ or some other designated state prosecutor to investigate these incidents, but they also, there's another section that authorizes the same action, making for a very confusing bill. So, like I said, while the league supported the initial version of this gut and amend measure, we removed our formal support when these local control provisions were removed that would have made these investigations, these independent investigations, mandatory only when requested by a local agency. And like I said, now the bill is left pretty unclear as to, really just unclear on implementation overall. So that pretty much wraps up public safety. Despite a very busy summer, there isn't a whole lot that reached the governor's desk to take action on. So happy to address any questions.
Thanks, Charles. We do have a couple items in the Q&A box, but just really quick, Charles, is there any sense of the landscape in public safety since so many bills did not move forward in the last night of session? What are you anticipating for next year? Give a little bit of a preview for everyone on this webinar.
Certainly, yeah. Well, so I guess a precursor for next year, I mean, like I mentioned, those police reform efforts that were in the vehicles SB 731 and SB 776, I would expect the authors or perhaps another author to bring versions of those bills back, some sort of variation of those proposals back for next year to try to see if they can change, have some police reform as they see fit. But beyond that, I would also expect there to be at least one cannabis measure that reintroduces the discussion on some sort of mandatory retail, or if there is a compromise on retail, trying to figure out a way to provide for more retail cannabis across the state. The details of that, are still obviously forthcoming, but there has been a lot of chatter in trying to, still bring more cannabis to California, despite the fact that, we do have local control provisions that cities and counties can regulate and or ban those if they see fit. So, you know, certainly expect to see some more on the cannabis front and the police reform front for 2021.
Sure, and since you are unmuted right now, we do have a question regarding the, and I apologize, the carotid, I can't never say the word, the chokehold.
Carotid artery.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We do have a question about what the league's position is on that, on the ban of that use of force.
Yeah, so so the league did not have a formal position on the carotid artery restraint measure, AB 1196 by Assemblymember Gibson. As I understand it, that bill did make it to the governor's desk, and so I would expect for him to sign that bill in fairly short order. But the league did not have a formal position on that bill, and so happy to address any other questions, you know, on that or any other policy.
Great, thanks, Charles. So along that similar path, I'm going to ask Jason to speak here right now of what he is foreseeing in the housing space for next year. And then there's a couple of housing related questions that we will get to after that.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, this year, like I said, I mean, really in housing and land use was the year that you know, wasn't really for a lot of these bills. So, you know, looking at next year, I mean, I really think a lot of these bills are going to come back. The pro tem certainly had some choice words for the assembly when her bill was sent to them so late that she couldn't take it up, SB 1120, SB 995. She was pretty angry about SB 1385 being held. That was the Caballero bill around those retail sites. I would expect a lot of that to be reintroduced, mainly because those bills died not for a lack of votes, but really either a lack of time or the fighting between the houses. I think the Assembly and the Senate are going to work a lot of that out next year, and you know, those measures probably will advance. I think the real question that we're going to be you know dealing with this fall is, you know, where's the legislature going to go? I mean, you know, we've been able to push back and fight off those 5- and 7-story buildings that would have been mandated along transit lines and SB 50 and some of the others. And, you know, now the duplex bill didn't advance this year. So where are they really going to go next year? But the one thing, you know, I can assure everybody, you know, we still have our housing proposal that's out there. I think that's a pretty good marker for what the league would like to see. You know, deals mainly with, you know, resources needed in order to help construct these homes. It's a cornerstone in planning that cities need to have the ability to plan where these units are going to go. And the cities can take, you know, actions to help, you know, streamline the process and move it along. So I think we'll be building off our housing production proposal next year, and we'll see where the legislature goes. But I do think it's going to be a very active year next year, particularly if there's some resemblance of normalcy when we go back into the Capitol and, you know, are able to lobby in the building and, you know, more staff will be there. I think we'll see a greater emphasis. If we're still dealing with the public health crisis that we are now, if it returns in a big way in the winter and early spring, I think the legislature will probably do less bills. I mean, if you look back to this year, we started with about 2,700 bills. By the time we neared the last couple of weeks of session, we were down to fewer than 500. So if the pandemic is still a major problem, I think we will see fewer bills, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to see fewer housing related bills. We could probably see more. So I think with all saying that, I think it's going to be a very active year next year in housing. And I did see another question here about AB 1561, which was a Christine Garcia bill that was amended. You know, it was a bill that was been around since last year, but it had some additional provisions added to it. We did not have a position on 1561. One part of the bill deals with a requirement that cities need to, when they do their governmental constraints analysis and the housing element, we have to look at things that we control that in some way inhibit housing production in our community. She wanted to add an additional layer to that analysis that we already have to perform, and that what are the governmental constraints that we may be imposing that are in some way impacting a protected class. So folks that maybe, you know, people of color, the LGBT community, you know, we need to now analyze what are the are there any barriers that we are putting up, or what are the barriers we're taking down in order to see more housing production for those folks. That was one part of the bill. We didn't object to that. The second piece of the bill deals with requiring cities to extend certain entitlements for 18 months based on the pandemic. This is something that we've done in the past, mainly around the Subdivision Map Act and all of those maps. We tend to extend those for several years, dealing with a recession. This time, builders wanted to include some additional entitlements. We were opposed to some of the earlier provisions, but in the end, we got to a place where we were okay with it. Many of our cities have already begun to extend those permits. This would make it more standardized throughout the state that we were going to allow for 18-month extensions. One thing I will say, though, is that it is a little irritating that the legislature has been claiming the housing crisis is largely a function of local government and us not moving fast enough, so us needing to streamline. And really, at the first chance, the building community wants to delay things. While I think their delay is justified, I think that there should be, some acknowledgement that local government, certainly has been removing barriers over the years, and we are already allowing for these extensions. But unfortunately, that really wasn't the case. But yeah, so yeah, we don't have a position on 1561. And let me see if there's another question on housing. Let me see here. Give me 1 second here.
And so, Jason, while you are looking, I'm going to go and ask for Charles Harvey to come back on. We've gotten a question about AB 2054 about Emergency Services Community Response Grant Program, and an SB 773 regarding the State 911 Advisory Board. Charles, can you give any updates on those two pieces of legislation?
Yes. Yeah, Assembly Bill 2054 by Assemblymember Kamlager. So that bill, as I understand it, would until I think 2024 enact the Community Response Initiative to strengthen Emergency Systems Act, or the Crises Act, for the purpose of creating, implementing, and evaluating that pilot program, and which the act would establish in an effort to provide resource to specified disadvantaged communities. That bill has made it to the governor's desk. That wasn't one that the league was monitoring super closely. We did not have a formal position on it, but that bill did pass the legislature and is on the governor's desk. As it relates to Senate Bill 773, that was another bill by Senator Skinner relative to, well, essentially the bill sought to revise the membership on the State 911 Advisory Board. And so that bill did not move after, I think, the middle of July. So that bill died before, I think, even getting a policy committee hearing. So those are those two bills.
Great, thank you. Jason, we ready to go back to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was more of a statement around, are we going to see some additional headwinds or more disruptions in single-family zones? I think the legislature, well, they have a fairly long track record now of, wanting to have more than just single family only zones. And if you look back to 2016 with the first accessory dwelling unit laws, essentially in California, we don't have single family only residential areas. It hasn't been that way for about 4 years because every residential parcel, the landowner can add an accessory dwelling unit to it or a junior accessory dwelling unit. So essentially every single family zone can have up to 3 units on it. As far as the legislature, potentially continue to go in that arena, much like SB 1120, where it would have been duplexes. I think, yes, I think they're going to continue to go that route. I think the question really for our cities, and I've heard this from other legislators, legislators and other city officials is, we're going to have to increase density in our communities, or we're going to have to find space for more people in our communities based on our arena numbers. And our arena numbers are getting quite large, especially in the 6th cycle. And I think it's really a matter of how do we want to do it? Do we want to add additional height in order to achieve that density, or do we want to maintain existing height limitations and do it just more by adding, ADUs or duplexes or fourplexes or whatever? I think our cities are largely going to make that decision on their own as they do their housing element. That's certainly something that we strongly would prefer, that, leave it up to local government to decide how they are going to plan for those units. Yeah, the state's going to tell us how many units we need to plan for, but we need the ability to move them around as we see fit within our communities and how it best fits within our communities. That was a cornerstone of the league's housing production proposal. So I think we're going to see the legislature continue to push in that arena, but we'll just see how it goes. The other question was about AB 725. This is a bill by Buffy Wicks. It's been around for a couple of years now. We did not take a position on that bill. We talked about it several times in our housing committee, but this bill basically says that when a city does do their housing audit, mainly for the 6th cycle, that they're going to need to do 25% of their sites need to be able to accommodate 4 to 100 units for their moderate and then their above moderate. This is something that we already do for affordable housing. When we set aside parcels for affordable housing, in order for us to get that safe harbor, we need to use the Mullen densities, which basically in our metropolitan areas, it's 30 units per acre, 20 in our suburban areas, and then 10 in the rural areas. And essentially for affordable housing, we do almost 100% of that number in multifamily. So now the legislature is saying, hey, you need to do 25% in your mod and above mod. The really important thing to note on this is the city maintains full ability to put it where they see best. So it's not in any way affecting where we put it, how we put it. As long as we do 25% within 4 units to 100 units, we have that full autonomy. And while we're just talking housing, I know there's a few other questions, but I had somebody ask me about the tenant protection bills. I didn't put them on this list, but the governor's already signed the 2 main tenant protection bills, AB 3088. That was the big one by Assemblyman Chu that balances the need of tenants and also the landlords. The governor signed that one. And then one that flew under the radar, but it's important to several of our cities, AB 2782, a daily bill that addresses mobile home parks. This bill actually gives cities greater authority over local mobile home park rent control. They can apply it to leases that are longer than a year. So I know that's a big deal for some of our cities, in particular the city of Carpinteria. That was a big deal for them. So those 2 measures did pass and provide a little bit more authority, at least on 2782 to cities.
Great, Jason. And can you speak to AB 2345 about density bonuses?
Yeah, so Assembly Bill 2345, this was a bill, there were 2 competing density bonus bills. One of them was SB 1085, that was the Skinner bill, which failed to advance at the last minute. I think caught a number of people off guard. And then you had AB 2345. We had an opposed unless amended position on AB 2345. The author largely took our amendments, and thus we were able to remove our opposition and go neutral along with the planners, the counties, CSAC, and the urban counties. It satisfied most of our needs. The thing to keep in mind with that density bonus bill is that she wanted to take the existing law from 4 concessions and incentives that we had to grant all the way up to 6. And that was just crazy. There's no way we could grant 6 concessions and still really retain our land use authority. So she pulled it back to existing law to 4, and then she did kind of tinker with some of the formulas or some of the percentages, but in large part, we went neutral on that bill.
And then Jason, can you speak to the AB 3182 about the amendments in the HOA bill?
Yeah, I can't remember, but this is something we didn't take a position on since it pertained, solely to the HOAs. I know that they were, I believe it did pass, and it was going to restrict an HOA's ability to prohibit rentals in their community. And I think the deal at the end was maybe like 25%. They could allow for up to 25% rentals or something to that effect. But yeah, again, since it was specific to HOAs, we did not take a position on it.
And then the last question for you, and then I'm going to shift over to 2 other lobbyists since we have other questions that are not just housing related, believe it or not, is SB 1085.
Okay, yeah, so SB 1085 was the Skinner version. We nearly got to neutral on that one. It was a snafu at the end of session past the deadline for amendments, but basically the way the bill was drafted, and it really was a function of existing law. When I took this bill to our internal housing policy committee and then ultimately to the board, we had an opposed unless amended position on the bill. The main amendment that we wanted was we wanted to make sure that a developer couldn't use density bonus law, so one of the concessions or incentives, to undermine a locally adopted inclusionary housing ordinance. And we have a couple of cities where they have a developer who's quite inventive and wants to use one of their concessions to not have to comply with an inclusionary housing ordinance at the local level that requires them to build a certain number of units within the project. So we had worked on some language to clarify that. But unfortunately, at the end of session, there was a mistake made and it just didn't happen. And, you know, we weren't able to get that amendment, but the measure did die. I think we were considering running something next year to make that clarification in existing law, so that, because the last thing we want to do is to allow our developer to not only undermine affordable housing policy, but particularly undermine that affordable housing policy developed by a city. We certainly don't want that to occur.
Thanks, Jason. And I just cannot continue to say enough thank yous for the amount of discipline and challenges that have been involved with the housing portfolio this year and how you have stepped up. This has certainly been the biggest topics for our membership, and just appreciate all your efforts and making sure cities are being fought for hard for in this area. I'm going to shift now to Bijan regarding AB 970. This was about moving the the election date from March to June. There's a question about if a council member becomes disqualified from serving from March to June, if their term was set to end between these months. Can you provide some clarity on that?
Yeah, happy to. So just by way of background, under the California Voter Participation Act of 2015, general law cities have to hold their elections on a statewide date. And so to comply with that, a number of cities changed their election dates from March of odd numbered years to March of even numbered years, beginning with March 2020. So some council members elected in March 2017 had their terms extended by 12 months from expiring in March 2021 to expiring in March 2022. However, 12 months is the maximum available time that you can extend your term. And so as a result of, if SB 970 becomes law, which we expect it to, though that very small subset of council members will have their terms expiring 3 months before the primary will be held as a result of SB 970. And so we've received commitments from both the Senate and the Assembly to work on fixing this for next year. It's not a very immediate problem, but it's one that we need to resolve immediately. My sense is, of the 6 cities that we're aware of currently where council members are affected, there's going to be probably the largest concentration in LA County. But I, again, would just encourage all of you to, if you are a city attorney, to check in on if your city was impacted by the CVPA. And if you aren't, to check in with your city attorney on that, just so you're aware, and reach out to us if necessary.
Great, thanks, Bijan. Going to shift to wildfires now. If I can have Derek Dolphy speak about AB 2167 and SB 292, and if you could provide just a quick description what those 2 bills do.
Sure, thanks, Melanie. So AB 2167 and SB 292 were both bills looking at insurance rates in the wildland urban interface areas. So obviously with the increase in catastrophic and very destructive wildfires over the last several years, folks that live in those areas, as I'm sure many of you have heard or live it yourselves, it's been increasingly more difficult to get property insurance from major insurers. They've either sent you those letters saying that they're no longer going to be carrying you as a policyholder and you have to move to the FAIR plan, or you simply just don't have options. So Senator Rubio, who is the chair of the insurance committee in the Senate, and Assemblymember Daly, Daly is the chair of the Assembly Insurance Committee, both had companion measures, which are the AB and SB respectively, that were trying to look at creating incentive-based or market incentive-based measures to provide insurance, property insurance for those homes that are in the WUI area, in the areas that no longer have readily available commercial property insurance. So it's my understanding that, well, first off, I have to say the league didn't have a position on these because they really dealt with property insurance, which is an area that we don't have a lot of existing policy on, was something that we were monitoring in the wildfire conversation. But as I indicated before, there's quite a bit of difference of opinion between the Assembly and the Senate on where they wanted to go on things with wildfires this year. So I saw at the end of session, SB 292 was essentially reduced down to 1 sentence over opposition that the opponents thought that they would be violating Proposition 103, which is a proposition that created the statewide elected position of the Office of the Insurance that Ricardo Laura is in, Commissioner of Insurance. And so they thought that it was unconstitutional to try and force these companies to provide insurance where they didn't want to without going through the proper rate setting system that's in place right now. And so that bill essentially was reduced down to one sentence, which was almost like a spot bill. It wasn't heard on the floor of the assembly at the end of session. And then Assemblymember Daley's bill also was not heard in the Senate. So neither of those bills came up for a vote, and thus both bills have not moved forward this year. So more to come on that, I'm sure, next year as we continue to see these wildfires increase in our communities. Thanks, Melanie.
Great, thank you, Derek. I know we have some more questions coming into the Q&A box, but I'd like to get to the next portion, and then we'll do these questions in the next round of the Q&A. With that, I'd like to turn this over to Nick Romo, our revenue and taxation lobbyist.
Hey everybody, thank you again for that introduction. I'd just like to start by reminding us where we came from and where we are. Starting this year, the state was up $5 to $7 billion in a surplus, ready to spend, ready to expand a number of key state programs and really take into consideration a number of expansive legislative proposals. And cities were also experiencing some modest gains in our general funds year over year over the last few years. Things were sort of moseying along for the most part in general. And then COVID-19 hit, and the state put out a large $54 billion deficit number. Cities, the League of Cities, we came out with a very sort of similar analysis of the significant hits to our sales tax base and our TOT base and the like that have really put our budgets in a hole. Over the last few months, some of the summer months, the state has really taken this to task in terms of closing their perceived $54 billion budget deficit. And the reason why I sort of start there is just because we tend to see in good times the state tends to focus on the funds that they have and the programs that they're funding with existing revenue sources, and we tend to not have too many battles with the state in terms of the local state relationship on revenues. As the revenue started to dip, of course, folks like myself and others started to pay closer and closer attention to each and every proposal to see if there was going to be some creative financing on the state side. I say that today, reporting that all in all, the relationship in terms of how the state balanced its budget and how they're thinking about doing it going forward does not do too much harm to local governments. We were able to stop a number of proposals that would have done that. A number of other proposals were passed through, but did have some backfill revenues there. So in terms of what the legislature did this session, there's not too much to report on. Of course, we continue to monitor other sort of sales tax deferral programs that you've seen on the state side that we continue to monitor and discuss and work through with the governor and the Department of Taxing Fee Administration. But on that end, not too bad. Of course, we've also secured $500 million from the budget from the state's CARES Act that has started to go out. Cities have received the first two payments of the $500 million. A third payment is coming again this month, and the remaining balance will be going out in the next month as well, as cities begin to report how they have spent and how they plan to spend their CARES Act dollars. I'm going to the next slide. I actually have good news and bad news. I have one bill for you this year, and it's actually a good bill for all of us, for a lot of us. This is SB 1441 by Senator McGuire. It would expand, extend the sunset date on the local prepaid mobile wireless service collections act. This act is constructed to help us collect for those cities that have utility users taxes that apply to prepaid mobile wireless products. It will help us to continue to collect those tax revenues, and will also help the CDTFA, the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, to collect the revenues. Deep inside in the weeds of this bill is also clarification that the tax applies to bundled services and bundled promotions that say companies like Cricket Wireless may sell you a phone and some minutes to go along with that phone. There was some clarification needed that the UUT applies to those transactions. Currently, according to my notes, we have 110 local governments that apply this UUT, and somewhere between $20 and $30 million a year in this tax. So we're glad that this bill sailed through the legislature, and we're requesting a signature and thank Senator McGuire for pushing it through this year. Particularly given that it does need to be passed this year because that sunset does come due at the end of this year. So we were happy to be able to continue to push this even through all the turmoil of this legislative session. And I'll just leave with, as my colleagues did, of what I'm looking forward to in the next few months, which is, of course, the legislature started to lay the groundwork for what recovery would look like over the next many years. In the state budget and in subsequent budget trailer bills, the legislature has begun to stand up a working group across several state departments, including the legislature, on what economic recovery bonds, economic recovery tax issues, economic recovery policies would look like. And so the league will be right at that table, putting our city interests on the table and making sure that we're part of the recovery discussions. And with that, I will turn it over to Caroline Cirincione.
Thanks, Nick. I'm Caroline Cirincione. I'm the legislative policy analyst that works the TCPW portfolio. You can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start off talking about two bills that we are requesting signatures on. The first is AB 1286 Marisucci, and this is the most important signature request I think we have in the TCPW portfolio at this moment. This is a 2-year bill that the League is actually sponsoring, and it will require shared mobility device providers to obtain a permit or an agreement with a city or county that it seeks to operate in, and also comply with all local operation, parking, maintenance, and safety rules. This is a good win for us because the unannounced arrival of these devices on city streets has often left local governments scrambling to come up with regulations regarding safety and enforcement and equitable distribution of services. AB 1286 will also require the industry to maintain general liability insurance coverage, which we're already seeing in some of our larger cities. Previous iterations of this bill included stringent consumer protections, specifically prohibiting mobility device providers from waiving the legal rights and remedies of their users in their user agreements. This provision faced pretty intense opposition from the industry, with providers like Bird and Lime reaching out to some cities directly threatening that AB 1286 would force companies to stop operating in California, which is obviously not something that we had wanted and was not the intention of the measure. So after working closely with the author's office, that provision was ultimately removed and all of the opposition to the bill went neutral. So that really allowed AB 1286 to continue moving through the legislative process. While we would have liked to have seen those liability protections included in the bill, we would have, we're really happy that the bill is still moving forward, and we wanted to focus on really allowing local governments to decide for themselves if they want these vehicles operating in their communities or not. Because for the last 2 years, we have seen over and over again threatening scooter bills in the legislature, such as AB 1112 Friedman, which wouldn't have allowed cities to ban these devices. And then also AB 3116 Irwin, which would have limited the types of data we could have received from the industry. So we're really happy that this good scooter bill is moving forward, and we are requesting the governor's signature on this measure. Next slide, please. Next bill I want to talk about is SB 865 Hill. This is a really common sense bill that we've been supporting. It seeks to strengthen safe excavation practices by increasing collaboration between excavators and operators, requiring data sharing amongst key stakeholders, and moving the Dig Safe Board from the Office of the State Fire Marshal to the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, which we think will better align with the board's mission and operational functions. SB 865 will increase communication by requiring regional notification centers, which provide warnings of excavations close to existing subsurface installations, to share damage reports with the Dig Safe Board within 5 days, and then also provide quarterly reports on all notifications. A really big component of this bill is that SB 865 also requires operators to begin mapping new subsurface installations with GIS beginning in 2023. So we've been supportive of these changes. As you know, excavations near and around underground infrastructure continue to pose safety risks to Californians, and we feel that promoting these safe excavation practices will ensure that these essential services which travel through underground infrastructure remain safe and operational. So we will be requesting the governor's signature on this measure as well. Next slide, please. And then before I close, I wanted to touch on broadband and closing the digital divide. During the June policy committees, the TCPW policy committee approved new league policy related to broadband. And this was timely as the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted how a lack of access could impact an individual's ability to access healthcare and work and education and even e-governance during this time. But despite increased attention to this issue, the two major broadband measures that were proposed this session ultimately failed and did not make it to the governor's desk. And then a highly anticipated administration/legislative broadband package never came to fruition. So there was not a lot done in this legislative session to address broadband and closing the digital divide. SB 1130 Gonzalez is the bill that the League was supporting. It specifically sought to expand the California Advanced Services Fund to encourage deployment of 21st century ready communications, meaning that the state would not be funding any kind of low quality infrastructure. The PUC was supportive of the concepts in SB 1130, but they really wanted to ensure that the California Advanced Services Fund would continue to be funded beyond the surcharge sunset of 2022. So AB 570 was introduced, and the bill did a variety of things, including extending the surcharge to fund the California Advanced Services Fund beyond 2022. However, the PUC and some other stakeholders believe that some of the provisions of the bill went beyond the scope of the California Advanced Services Fund and could have the unintended result of delaying California Advanced Services Fund's grants and possibly even slowing deployment. This session, these two bills were really pitted against one another. There were rumors of a compromise, but we did not end up seeing that happening. We did see a summary for the administration/legislative broadband proposal. It's possible that SB 1130 and AB 570 were sidelined in favor of the proposal, which really brought together the best of both bills. Or it's possible that we will see a compromise or new legislation next year with some of these similar key components. In terms of this administration legislative broadband proposal, we'd been hearing that this might come up at the end of session, but it didn't end up happening. In reviewing the summary of the proposal, it appears that most of what was included aligned really well with league policy, and as I mentioned before, combined some of the better components of SB 1130 and AB 570. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some of these same themes come up again next year. It would have been great to see it in print, but I think unfortunately the legislature ran out of time. A couple key components of this proposal is that it sought to remove the sunset for the California Advanced Services Fund surcharge, which is key to continuing to fund the program. It required future-proof infrastructure as detailed in SB 1130, so that we won't have to be replacing this infrastructure in the next few years. It expanded eligibility for the program to incorporate chronically underserved individuals who may not be able to access digital platforms due to slow speeds. It also made it easier for local governments to apply for these grants, and it removed some barriers to deployment, such as relying on state data for unserved areas rather than unsustained industry claims of service, and then also removing the first right of refusal, which would allow, which currently allows the industry to continue to provide intents to service areas while often failing to follow through on that intent. So as I mentioned, none of these proposals moved forward this session, but going into next year, I would anticipate we'd see some broadband related measures. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions and hand it back to Melanie.
Great, thanks, Caroline. I know we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box, but I figure one of the questions, which is a much broader crystal ball question, is what does the fall look like? What is happening with the governor, if there's going to be a special session called? I will kick it off with that, and then I'll turn over to the lobbyists to answer the specific bill questions that have come in. This has been an interesting legislative year, as you've heard sprinkled throughout with each of the lobbyists and some of the different narratives and challenges that have come in. The legislature having to take an unprecedented recess from March to May, then having to take another recess in July due to a couple members testing positive for COVID. And then we came into the week before the legislative session ended and having a senator test positive, and that required quite a few senators to have to vote remotely in the Senate, which created a lot of tension, not only between the houses, between the Assembly and the Senate, but also within each of the houses. So it created some chaos towards the last day, and I'm sure you've seen articles about what had happened or not happened. But going into the fall, looking at a special session, there's a few things to keep in mind. As you all know, we still need money. Local governments need money. The state needs money. There's still a major push going on at Congress for a federal stimulus package. We are still pushing forward on that and fighting for that. In fact, you'll probably be hearing from us in the next week or so, doing more action alerts as Congress will be coming back into session. So that is playing into some of the, what is Congress going to do? Are we going to be able to get federal dollars that can come into this state? That would help the state coffers. That helps local government. So that's one component that will play into a determination if a special session is needed. Additionally, if I'm the governor, I'm going to wait and see what Congress does. You don't want to get ahead of Congress if there is the opportunity for federal stimulus dollars to be coming into the state. The state right now, the budget, the sales tax, the tax receipts that are coming in are above projections. So there's not a dire need for special session right now. And they did run budget trailer bills towards the end of session that did get to the governor's desk. So they were working in August on items that would help with budget concerns. Additionally, where you might see, if there's a question, if there's housing or wildfire special sessions that will be needed, that will play out again over the upcoming months. As of right now, as I will say, our crystal ball today, I am not fully certain we will have a special session this fall. Also keep in mind it is an election year, so that plays into the fact that there are elected officials who will be out in the field campaigning. And so if you call a special session and with Congress in session, what does that timing look like? So if we were to see anything, it most likely would be after Election Day, and they would go and truncate it into November. Again, that is very fluid. That is just of this moment. There are people who are making a lot of requests of the governor for a special session, but I believe the governor will feel that it has to be a very compelling reason to call the legislature back in to conduct business this fall. We will certainly keep you updated as we hear information, but that is what we know as of right now. So with that, I'm going to go and call on Jason Ryan to give an update on AB 1845, the Office of Homelessness.
Yeah, this is a bill that we did not take a position on for a couple of reasons. Just briefly on what the bill does. So 1845 would create this new Office of Homelessness to end homelessness, and it would create the secretary position. It would also create a advisory council and then an advisory board. And we tried to get local government to be on one of those or both of those bodies. And when we met with the author early on, we mentioned it, there really wasn't an appetite to add a local government representative directly. I mean, it's possible that somebody from local government could serve, but out of all of the positions on each one of those, there's no local government person. So we felt as though it probably wouldn't be all that advantageous for the league to support it, since we can't have a representative on it. Additionally, the governor was pretty vocal about his opposition to creating this secretary level position. At first, he said he wanted one, then he said he didn't, and then he created his advisory group himself. So, as a league, I don't think we wanted to weigh into that fight between the administration and the legislature, particularly because we didn't have a seat at the table. But the measure did pass, and it's on his desk. We'll see if he moves forward and signs it.
Great, thanks, Jason. Nick, SB 1049, can you give us an idea of what next year could look like for that bill?
Sure, yeah. So SB 1049 by Senator Glazer was a measure that was introduced in response to a tragic shooting at a Airbnb last Halloween, in which the Airbnb was being rented for one night, for a quiet night, one person in a home. But it ended up being a large party, in which again ended in the fatal shooting of a number of individuals. So SB 1049 would have actually expanded the penalty amounts that you as local officials could assess against those who violate your local short-term rental ordinances. And it would also continue to allow us to, introduce more rigorous or more rigorous ordinances at a local level. We were neutral at this time on 1049. This bill did fail. It seems to be a victim of the clock, as we've mentioned, as the legislature ran out of time on the last night of session. I do expect 1049 to come back next year. It seems to have enough support to move forward. We'll continue to work on it. I'm hoping we can get to support so we can continue to make sure that our local ordinances rightfully and properly govern how Airbnbs are hosted in our cities.
Great, thank you, Nick. And with that, I do not see any other Q&A in the any questions in the Q&A box. This is our contact information, so please do not hesitate to reach out to anyone on this slide if you have any questions about specific bills or more general questions of what's going to be coming up over the next few months or next year. We are here for you. We are your advocates. We are fighting daily for you. Please use us as a resource if you have any questions, concerns. We are here. That I can't emphasize that enough. Just cannot say enough thank yous to each of you. City leaders, you've had a tough year, and the challenges that have presented themselves and trying to navigate fighting for resources and needs that your cities need while also trying to defend and protect what you have and not have the legislature come in and continue to potentially chip away at any local government authority. We just appreciate all your efforts and your leadership and wish you much, much, much success this fall as we move forward. And we are going to continue to fight to go and get you the dollars you need and the resources you need to address COVID and to protect for your revenue and for your constituents. So thank you again for everything that you are doing out in your cities. I would like to go and also do a last bookend plug for our annual conference, which will be virtually held October 7th through 9th. As our executive director said in the beginning, and I'll say at the end, this is going to be such a great event. As we've all made the interesting transition to a virtual environment, our team has working very diligently to make sure that this is the best virtual event you attend this year, besides this webinar. We really want to see you there. This is such a great opportunity for each of you to participate and to get additional exposure to the league and what we're doing and all the fantastic things that are taking place in each of your communities. So again, you can register, I believe, at cacities.org/events. So thank you all for your time today. Our team, Jason, templates will be up later today. Yes, I got a thumbs up. So yes.
Absolutely.
We will have that information available to you. So again, thank you. Have a wonderful Wednesday, and don't hesitate to contact us if you need anything.